thanks everyone for coming and for your introductions in the chat box. We're happy to welcome Grace Johnson today, who's our guest speaker for this webinar. So Grace is a Hedgehog Officer at Hedgehog Street, which is a national campaign run jointly by the People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. Grace is also a co-author of Britain's first ever National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy, which is what this webinar is going to be about today. So I'll hand over to you, Grace.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me okay and everything?
I can. Let us
Perfect,
know
thank you.
if you can.
Okay. Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. Really happy to be here to chat all things hedgehog, which is my favourite topic. And specifically for this talk, I'll be talking about the National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy. This is a document that's been a couple of years in the making, and we launched it back in it was sort of the middle of October. So you might have seen we did a lot on social media. That was across PTS and BHPS social media channels. That was the kind of lead image that we used. So it might be a little bit familiar to some of you. You might have seen it. You might have even read the strategy. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let's work. Cool. So yeah, I guess the first question is why did we do this? Why was this strategy needed in the first place? So first of all, the two charities that make up Hedgehog Street, the People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society that have just been mentioned. We also work together to create the State of Britain's Hedgehogs report. So we do this every few years. We bring together lots of different wildlife survey data, and we just do a bit of a check on how hedgehog populations are faring across Britain. And really the last few reports, including the most recent one in 2022, showed that there's been quite ongoing declines, particularly in rural areas. There's a slight stabilization on the urban side of things, but generally we've seen quite significant declines in the last couple of decades. So that kind of prompted this, we'd seen this same trend kind of continuing for the last few reports. So we thought, this is the time to kind of bring all of the actions and kind of, work collaboratively with other stakeholders to try and address these declines. So a couple of other reasons. So we did have a previous, it was kind of a strategy, but it was more of a bit of a work plan. It was a kind of internal checklist of the things that we wanted to achieve. So that one, it was very much internal. It was for PTS and BHPS. It didn't have any wider stakeholder input. It was quite research focused as well. It was a bit like, these are the knowledge gaps that we want to fill. It lacked sort of specificity. It lacked any kind of target. So it was a bit of a work plan, but we wouldn't know when some of the objectives were achieved because there wasn't any sort of targets within that. And also within a new strategy, we wanted to have kind of framework for local action plans as well. So the sort of strategy / work plan that we were working to previously was kind of our direction. It was the things that we were going to do. But what we wanted to do with this new strategy is bring together all of these different efforts, because there's so many organizations working and doing things for hedgehogs, but we wanted everybody to be kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. So it was to sort of bring together all of these different actions and have this national strategy, but then also framework for kind of local and regional action plans as well. So there's a few reasons there. So the process has very much been led by PTS and BHPS. We kind of got everything going. There we go. So the first thing that we did was put together an organising team for this. So this was to kind of oversee and organise the whole process. It was kind of a sort of key group of people. So we had obviously people from PTS and BHPS, and then also the statutory agencies, so Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot. We thought that the rehabilitation sector was quite important to include, because that's obviously such a big part of, the sort of the landscape of what's happening with hedgehogs. There's a lot of hedgehog carers out there. And then also we thought that the farming community would be good to include at this early stage. So we had a sort of consulting member from the National Farmers Union. And the process was facilitated by the IUCN. It was the Conservation Planning Specialist Group. So they kind of work on species conservation. They've put together sort of previous species action plans and conservation strategies. So, for example, they'd previously worked on the Scottish beaver strategy. So that was one that we kind of looked to for, an example of a British species and kind of bringing all the stakeholders together and sort of just how that worked, really. So, yeah, the first thing was the organising team. So the first thing that we did, I'll talk a little bit about the kind of process of how we got to the strategy, and then towards the end of the talk today, I'll talk about some of the content and actually what the key things were within the strategy. So the first thing that we did was a threat analysis workshop. So it was it was last year, getting my years mixed up. It was last year in January. We had about 18 people there. We had some of the key hedgehog researchers, people from Hedgehog Friendly Campus, of course. The statutory agencies were there. We had carers and someone who was a vet, kind of working on the wildlife side of things, ecologists, and we had our two IUCN facilitators there. So this was a kind of core group of people to basically map out, because we've got a bit of an idea of the kind of threats that hedgehogs are facing, but there's so many, they're such a ubiquitous species. There were so many different things to cover. And we also wanted to understand the factors that led to the threats, what's causing all of these different threats, what are the effects of the threats, how different threats link together, all of this type of stuff. So the threat analysis was a really good way of just kind of mapping everything out and just really getting an understanding of kind of what we're dealing with here. So the day involved, the first thing that we did was a group mind map of the hedgehog threats. So this was a lot of post-its. You can see those on the right-hand side there. We basically went round and round the room and just kept listing threats until we were basically tapped out. So we just kept on going, just hashed out absolutely everything that we could think of. So that was all the way down from kind of garden injuries to individual hedgehogs, with a strimmer or a lawnmower, all the way up to things like climate change and everything in between. It was really trying to just kind of cover the whole suite of threats that we could think of. The next thing that we did was to cluster those. So we put them into different categories. So a good example would be urban and rural. There were quite a lot of the threats that kind of were specific to those two landscapes. We put together causal flow diagrams. So what are the drivers of each of these threats and what are the consequences of each of these threats as well? We looked at different patterns within the threats, and we also had a look at direct and indirect threats. So the direct threats are what kind of directly cause hedgehog mortality. So something like roadkill, that's a kind of direct threat, it's affecting, individuals, populations. And we also looked at indirect threats. So that would be, an example of that would be something like intensive rural management. It's not that in itself isn't kind of directly causing the decline. There's a few interim steps, but it's a broader one. And then finally, we identified knowledge gaps as well. So there's a lot that we know about hedgehogs. There's also a lot that we don't know. So we sort of mapped out all of that and then looked at research from other species that could sort of carry over into hedgehogs with a pinch of salt, kind of what can we learn from other research. So from all of the threats, we sort of mapped them out, had all these causal flow diagrams, and then basically this is what we came out with at the end, which is basically unreadable, but it's just to show this was the level of complexity that we were dealing with. All of these drivers, the red box in the middle, you can't really see it, but it's that red box is basically the decline in hedgehog populations, and all of these things around the outside are things that are causing that, things that are sort of, leading to the threats, all of the consequences, how they all link together, and we basically came up with this absolutely horrifying diagram. But yeah, I thought I'd just put it here just so you can see, yeah, just what we were dealing with. This was a really complex picture. One thing that was a little bit easier to understand was this. We basically, from that workshop, came up with this list of direct threats. So not those kind of indirect ones. These are the things that are directly leading to either reduced reproductive fitness, increased mortality, or lower density of populations. And they're those kind of drivers of the decline in the hedgehog population. So these are a little bit more, yeah, of the direct ones. So things like, decrease in available documented declines in the invertebrate species that hedgehogs would be would be eating. Increased predations, that's obviously talking about badgers, they're sort of directly preying on hedgehogs. Infectious disease was on there. Vehicle collisions, of course, is a direct threat. So that was, we sort of came up with this list of 23 direct threats that we took forward into the next workshop. So the next workshop was 3 days. That was again in Manchester. It was last year. We had about 30 people there. So we kind of broadened it out. We had a lot of people from the threat analysis workshop, all of the researchers, all of the kind of usual suspects. We included other conservation NGOs, sort of, people like RSPB, more people from the rehab sector. But then we really tried to broaden it out as much as possible. So we invited a lot of major landowners. So I'm just looking at the list there, people like Network Rail, and we had developers there. So we had a representative from Taylor Wimpey, who we've partnered with previously. ID Verdi, which is a green space management company. So they manage kind of sports pitches and parks all over Britain. Game and Wildlife, the British Veterinary Zoological Society, the National Farmers Union, and also the Nature Friendly Farming Network. We tried to include as many of the key stakeholders as we could within this process. So it was anybody that could influence the strategy or anybody that would be influenced by the strategy. And there was more people that we wanted to have there. Obviously this was a 3-day workshop. There were a lot of people that couldn't come. So that's just, those were the people that were able to. So yeah, we just tried to get as much variety as possible. Because with the best will in the world, if you just have all your kind of conservation organizations there, you're going to miss something from, someone who has more knowledge of kind of infrastructure and development. We needed all of those voices there because of all of these threats that we had outlined in the previous workshop. So this was the process. So the first thing that we did, I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail, but basically we came up with a sort of vision for where we want to see hedgehogs in 30 years' time. We prioritized the key threats that we had from that first workshop. We put together goals and strategies for those threats, and then we came up with research priorities as well. So the first thing was the vision statement. So this is the kind of, the very kind of top line element of the strategy. So where do we want to see hedgehogs in 30 years? So it was 2053. We should probably have made it 2054 because it sort of took us a year to get all the information together in the end. But yeah, the vision that we had was wild hedgehog populations thriving from towns to countryside, supported through our combined actions, meeting the needs of people and nature. And all of the phrases within there are very carefully selected. We've not just kind of thrown this together. There was various workshops to come up with this vision. All of the terms in there have definitions within the strategy. So what do we mean specifically? And also success indicators. So when will we know when these things are achieved, basically? Yeah, so all quite specific. And that's the overarching sort of vision and message of the strategy. The next thing that we did was a threat prioritization exercise. So we had those 23 direct threats from the first workshop. And we kind of got ourselves into groups. We had all these little stickers. And basically we had to put our stickers on, kind of identify as individuals, both. So sort of 2 questions. Which of these direct threats are the most pressing? Which ones do we perceive as being the real kind of danger spots for hedgehogs? And then we also had to have a look at which of these direct threats can be most easily addressed, because it was quite important to factor that in. There was some things that we sort of can't necessarily hope to address within the scope of a hedgehog strategy. So we had to kind of assign points based on these 2 factors. And it was the individuals doing that. So it was, I would have a very different idea of the most pressing threats compared to somebody who, from Network Rail or National Highways, for example. So we're all kind of bringing our individual experience and knowledge. We combined those scores to create a list of the kind of key threats. So there was 23, and in the end, the group selected how many we actually wanted to address, because 23 is a little bit too many. We'd be spreading ourselves too thin. So it was how many do we want to address within the scope of this new strategy? So we came up with 6. We deemed that as sort of a manageable number. And those 6 threats are here. So the first one was decrease in availability and distribution of natural food. And I think we said and associated habitat within that as well. So as I say, it's these kind of documented declines of invertebrate species. So the kind of earthworms, beetles, earwigs, things like that hedgehogs would be preying on. You know, there's more kind of, it's linked to kind of chemicals, you know, pesticides, you know, people having gardens that are too tidy and they don't have those wild areas, the way that we manage our green spaces, the way that we manage our kind of farmland and rural areas. So that was a really big one. That was a big sort of chunky one to address, but we thought that it was a really important one to have in there. And a lot of people put that as their sort of number one threat. So that was the number one. The second one was increased vehicle collisions. So perhaps not the easiest one to address, but we sort of couldn't ignore that it was a really key issue. You know, we've got sort of the data saying that kind of 10 to 15% of the population is killed each year on the roads. So it was, you know, we couldn't really ignore that. The next 2 are linked to people. So the third one is, this is basically actions by humans that are, you know, they've got good intentions and they're well-meaning, but they could have negative side effects. So things like inappropriate supplementary feeding, hedgehogs being admitted to care when they perhaps don't need to be, there's nothing wrong with them. There's certainly concerns around kind of supplementary feeding. You know, if you look at people feeding garden birds as an example, it's something that's a really widespread practice. But actually, as time's gone on, there's all these concerns about different diseases, that it's changing the behavior of the birds as well. So we've never really kind of studied that in any great detail with hedgehogs. So it was that kind of, it's things that people are doing that are well-meaning, but it's just, they could have that negative side effect. And it's just, you know, we need to kind of look at that a little bit further. The next one is also linked to people. So it's accidental death and misadventure, which I love that word, but basically that's your more kind of things that people are doing, but not deliberately. And it's generally by accident. So it's the kind of strimming accidents, hedgehogs falling into ponds, you know, when they're doing roadworks and they have these big kind of open holes in the road and that there's kind of barriers around so that people don't fall in, but there's no sort of safeguard for hedgehogs. So that's more the accidental side of things. Toxin accumulation was another one. So within this strategy, we focused on microplastics and rodenticides. And then the final one was genetic isolation. So that kind of links to habitat fragmentation. It's populations becoming isolated. They can't, you know, there's too many barriers within the environment and they can't sort of get to each other and sort of intermingle. So throughout the strategy, this number 6 was kind of absorbed into number 1, because a lot of the goals and actions for threat number 1 were kind of addressed. They also addressed threat number 6. So a lot of threat number 1, the kind of actions for that were all about connecting up habitat. So that kind of addressed that habitat fragmentation issue, which was number 6. So it's kind of 6 key threats, but really in practice, it's sort of 5. So for each of these threats, we put together either one or more goals. So what is the change that's needed to counteract each threat and what's the desired result? We put together strategies, so how we're going to achieve these goals. We put potential actions. So crucially, this strategy isn't an action plan. It was sort of potential actions. These are some of the things that we could do. So kind of examples of that tangible work that would need to be undertaken to implement the strategies. Success indicators, so the mechanisms that we would use to monitor the actions taken and the sort of consequences. So when will we know kind of when we're achieving success with addressing this particular threat? So unfortunately, I don't really have time to go through kind of everything. Oh, bit of background.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Yeah, so I don't really have time to go through all of the kind of goals, strategies, actions, all of that kind of thing. So I thought I'd take you through the goal statements just to give you a bit of a flavour. And then, of course, you can have a look at the actual strategy document if you wanted a bit more information and kind of, you know, a broader picture. So these were the kind of broad statements. The goal statements were quite kind of broad of the, what change is needed to counteract the threat and kind of what's the desired result. So threat one, that decrease in availability and distribution of natural food and associated habitat. This one, because it's such a big and important one, it had multiple goals. So there was quite a few kind of things that we wanted to look at within this. So the first one is about improving connectivity. So specifically within the countryside, the rural landscape. We want to establish more kind of functioning wildlife corridors to allow hedgehogs to move around, to meet those resource needs, and also to facilitate gene flow. The next one was also about habitat connectivity, but on the urban side of things. So that very much fits into what Hedgehog Street does, all about hedgehog highways, those gaps in fences to let hedgehogs through. Again, that's going to sort of do what we were saying with the first one. It's going to meet resource needs and facilitate gene flow, but just in the urban environment rather than the rural. The next one was to enhance plant diversity. So that's both structural and species and complexity within the urban environment to increase hedgehog resources. So kind of focus on, the kind of habitat and food of hedgehog prey, and kind of, that's going to, when doing that one, it's going to improve the natural food available for them, and also the kind of nesting in the habitat. The next one was the increase, so 1D, increase quantity of quality, functioning and connected habitat within the countryside. We had one about pesticides and veterinary medicines, because that's something that's reducing the amount of natural food for them. And then finally, we'd like to elevate the status of hedgehogs within legislation and policy. So this is something that we've kind of had campaigns running for in the past. BHPS did a big campaign a couple of years ago to try and increase the legal protection. So we wanted to see hedgehogs on Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. There's not a lot of political appetite for things like that at the moment, but there's other sort of mechanisms within legislation where we can sort of ensure that hedgehogs are considered. So things like local nature recovery strategies, a lot of those are being developed at the moment, and there's a lot of local authorities that are selecting hedgehogs as a sort of a key species within that, and we can very much kind of help them with these plans. Things like BNG, elms that are coming into, they're being developed for the sort of rural side of things. So that kind of legislation and policy one was the final one. The next few threats don't have as many goals. This one was just, obviously, as I say, just quite a big sort of meaty one. So there's quite a lot to address within that. So on the increased vehicle collisions, we'd like to reduce road collisions in order to allow hedgehogs to move through the landscape safely, to contribute to securing hedgehog populations. And some of the things within that, it's obviously, this is a really difficult one to address. We don't want to be telling people to kind of brake for hedgehogs and then that causes an accident behind you. It's a really difficult one to kind of know what to do, but certainly there's kind of measures that are coming into effect, like, more 20-mile-an-hour roads. That's something, researchers showed that could potentially help hedgehogs, just kind of traffic calming measures. So we would kind of work to support those measures that it looks like, they're going to be coming into effect anyway. The next one, so that was the threats due to people, those sort of unintentional ones. So the goal for this one is to reduce the risk of human interventions while supporting the benefits, to minimise unintended mortality and morbidity in hedgehogs. So within that, we're kind of acknowledging that there's risks, but there's also benefits as well. In a landscape where their natural food is declining, that supplementary food that we put out for them could be a lifeline for certain individuals. So we want to reduce the risks, but keep those benefits as much as possible. The next one, so this one was encourage widespread awareness and human behaviour change to reduce the risk of accidents and misadventure in hedgehogs. So these were the things where people are doing them by accident. So it's often, things out in the garden, it's the strimmer, the lawn mowers. And the really difficult thing with this one is that people aren't doing it deliberately. Generally, when these things happen, it's by accident. No one's kind of going out with a strimmer to deliberately hurt them. So how do you get people to just have hedgehogs at the forefront of their mind when they're out in the garden, or that, whether they're sort of someone in the garden, or if they're a green space manager for the council, how do you get people to just think hedgehog? Because it's something that people know of, and you know that this is a risk, but it's still happening. So how do we get people to change their behavior, basically? So that's going to be a really interesting one to tackle. The next one was toxin accumulation. So develop inclusive approaches to reduce and or replace the use of harmful chemicals in order to eliminate any negative impacts on hedgehogs and other non-target wildlife. And as I say, the sixth threat, the genetic isolation, was kind of encompassed into the first one because there was a lot about sort of connecting up landscapes and habitat. So that was, very much addressed within the first threat. As part of the workshop as well, a lot of the researchers got together and just had a bit of a think about where the gaps are. How do these gaps link with the key threats? Because there's certain things that we don't know, but it might not be as important as things that we don't know that kind of link to the key threats there. So this is the list that we came up with. So the first one is identifying healthy hedgehog habitats. So what are the features that actually support healthy populations of hedgehogs as well as other species in different habitat types? And also what are the responses to localized kind of habitat changes? Because we've got a fairly good idea about this, but there's still a lot that we don't know in terms of the specifics. Basic demography was the next one, and sort of causes of mortality. So we need kind of data on birth rates and juvenile survival. That's something that we don't really have with hedgehogs. Also figures on death rates and what are the actual causes of death at different life stages. So that'll be not an easy one to get information on because we need kind of long-term data on hedgehogs. How do you get that? That's a real challenge. So that's something that we're looking at the moment. Supplementary feeding. So there's a lot of discussion around supplementary feeding, as I mentioned earlier. So if you look at something like bird feeding, there's disease risk, it's changing their behavior. There's already been research that shows kind of increased aggression because they're a solitary animal, but when you put a food bowl out, you're bringing them together unnaturally, and that causes aggression. There's potentially issues like with birds, with hedgehogs around kind of disease transmission. There's issues around it potentially affecting their natural cycle, so delaying hibernation or potentially even stopping them from hibernating if there's a ready supply of food. So a lot of questions there that need answering, basically. The next one was the long-term fates of released hedgehogs. So when they've been rehabilitated, after they've been brought into a carer, there've been studies on released hedgehogs up to, I think, about 8 weeks they've been tracked, with kind of varying, survival rates. But what happens after that? Does being brought into care and then released, does that make them, more resilient after a couple of years? Does that, put them more at risk? There's more that we need to find out about with that. And then the final one, genetics. So what we were looking at with that one is the kind of usefulness of translocations for smaller isolated populations. Should we be sort of moving them around? It's not something that we currently recommend, but potentially that could be a measure to help smaller kind of isolated populations. We could also use that to look into the kind of effects of fragmented habitats, so kind of specific barriers. We had a few additional research topics as well. I won't kind of go through these in too much detail, but there were a lot of, for all the research, the fantastic research that's being done on hedgehogs, there's always really quite a lot that we still need to know. We don't have all of the answers, and there's a lot that we would like to know. So those were just a couple of these sort of additional ones. So in terms of the governance of this, we don't want this to just be a document that sits on a shelf forevermore. We're going to kind of create a structure to make sure that we have all of the expertise that we had in the workshops. How can we keep those people involved? How can we keep that expertise moving forward? So there'll be a kind of steering group at the top, a kind of management group that's just overseeing everything, a technical advisory group, which would likely be researchers within that, and then have different working groups. So we've tried to kind of cluster them into these sort of key areas. So we'd have different people sitting on each of these working groups. And then within that first one, obviously, that's again links to that first threat, which is a big one. So that's where it would break into urban and rural, because the points within that one sort of broke up quite nicely. So that's kind of an idea. This is all sort of to be finalised. We haven't invited anybody to the working groups. We're still kind of very early stages with all of this. So the next step is to, as I say, finalise that governance. And then look at action plans and kind of how they're going to work, because this is a very top line national document. It doesn't really have actions in there. It's got sort of potential actions, things that we could do, but those, the needs of different areas are going to be really important. So an action plan for London, for example, is going to look very different to an action plan in, Norwich, Norfolk, that's going to have a lot more kind of agricultural land. So it needs that sort of local detail to make sure that we're kind of maximizing our impact with this. So those are the things that we're going to be doing next. We're also currently recruiting for a rural hedgehog officer, because within the strategy there was a lot on the rural side of things. That's the kind of critical area really. And a lot of the work that we've done so far is focused on the urban areas, just with things like the Hedgehog Street campaign. That's very much focused on kind of gardens and connecting gardens and speaking to neighbours and things like that. So we recognised that there was a need to have more dedicated project work and time on the rural side of things. So we're recruiting somebody to sort of look after that. And then, yeah, I guess it'll just be over the coming sort of months and years, we'll be beginning to roll all of this out. And yeah, it's all very exciting. And actually, I should mention as well, it's not in any of my slides, but we've also, I know a lot of you will be aware of the National Hedgehog Monitoring Programme. So I know there's a challenge that's either started or it's kind of starting soon to get people to kind of classify images. And actually, with the monitoring programme, we're looking at getting kind of population estimates for hedgehogs at different sites all over Britain. So that's, the data that's going to come from that is going to help us to understand whether we're reaching the targets within the strategy. So it's quite a nice feedback loop that's going to sort of inform how things are going. And so it's these two new projects that we've launched this year that go hand in hand really nicely. And it's this kind of, we're scaling up and we're working collaboratively to address these hedgehog declines. And yeah, I think that's everything from me. So I'll stop sharing there. But yeah, thank you for listening. And then yeah, if there's any questions.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, Grace. It was so good to hear about the strategy in more detail and just the whole process of putting it together, really, with so many people and so many different backgrounds. I love that.
Yeah.
So yeah, as Grace said, we do have a little bit of a Q&A session now. So does anyone have any questions for Grace? You can put them in the chat box or unmute. I do actually have a couple of questions as well, Grace, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, go for it.
Amazing. So, which of the 6 threat priorities do you believe will be the most challenging to address?
That's a good question. The first one is obviously very big. It's quite a large one to address. But there's kind of things within that we can do, and there are kind of measures, in terms of seeing more biodiversity across farmland, for example. There's things that we'll be doing, but there's also kind of environmental land management schemes coming in. There's kind of things being done. So I think on that side of things, while it is a very big problem and it will be a difficult one to tackle, there's a lot of other organizations working on it. There's a lot that's kind of being done from different angles, so we can kind of, further those. But something like roadkill, I think, will be really tricky, because there sort of isn't an obvious answer. And so there's research that's found that kind of traffic calming measures, so like chicanes and speed bumps and signs, can be useful, but all of those things cost money, and it's how do you justify to the local council that these should be installed for hedgehogs. I mean, they're not really going to do that. They install those things for human safety. They're not, the hedgehog safety is not really their concern. So we're going to have to kind of come in and say it's good for humans and hedgehogs. And yeah, so that one's going to be a really interesting one because and again, it's no one's doing it deliberately. People aren't kind of running them over, but it is just a really widespread problem. And I would anticipate that being a really tricky one to address. But it's something that we've done research on. There's some research coming out next year on kind of the impacts of roadkill and also potential mitigation measures. So we do have, we've got some information kind of coming through on what we can do on that side of things. But I do think that one will be an interesting one to look at and sort of progress.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. There's some that have come through in the chat box now as well.
Oh, fab. What can local hedgehog groups, such as the one in our university, do to help towards these goals? So what I would envision that we'll be doing next is, so we'll be coming up with kind of local action plans. So they might be kind of regional or kind of county-wide. But what I'd really like to do as well is create a bit of an action plan or guidance on how to create an action plan for kind of more local groups. Because what you've got is across Britain, there's a lot of fantastic just local volunteer groups that are just within one village or one town or sort of one university campus. And there's a lot that those groups can be doing. And I don't want to exclude those. So we'll be coming up with kind of ways for people to get involved. I mean, a lot of what you guys, in terms of Hedgehog Friendly Campus, in terms of what you're doing at the moment is great. That's, it's the raising awareness, it's habitat improvement, kind of training land managers. All of that stuff all of the stuff we've been doing up until this point is still very much valid. It's just going to be done in a more kind of strategic and collaborative way. So yeah, there will be some guidance on kind of how specific groups can help, but that'll come a little bit further down the line. I don't want to sort of skip any. I'll just have a quick look through. So that one. Do you have behavior change experts working with you? So people like psychologists with that expertise? Not currently. So as I say, we're still in the very early stages of this, but yes, I would really like to do that because it's kind of beyond the realms of our expertise. I don't know how to get people to change their behavior. We can put out as much kind of shocking imagery as we want, but it's how do you sort of flip that? So there's examples of where this has been done really well. So there's stuff about plastic straws. That was a really, there was all the stuff, the awful images of kind of turtles having straws in their nose and things like that. And yeah, there are kind of ways, and there has been a lot of research on behavior change and how to kind of achieve that. So we'd need to be looking at that. How do you get people to, anytime they pick up a strimmer, they think, I need to check for hedgehogs? Because if it was me, I'd do that, but I very much work with hedgehogs and it is at the forefront of my mind. But how do we ensure that kind of filters down? How do we get people to do that? So I'd really like to sort of look at the research and sort of see, how we can best change behavior. Believe it or not, Hedgehog Friendly Campus is a behavior change program. Fantastic.
A great place to start anyway.
Yes.
It'd be great to have psychologists involved there.
Yeah, definitely. And that was something that we kind of chatted about in the workshop because we can say as much as we want, check before you go out with your strimmer and your lawnmower, but these accidents do still happen. So how do we get our message to the wider population? Even if you put it on the front page of a newspaper, they'll look at it once, but then a lot of people just kind of forget. How do you make it so that it's worked a little bit with bonfires, because you talk about bonfires and people say, oh, we're supposed to check for hedgehogs. So it's just getting that kind of connection, I guess, in people's brains. But yeah, it'll be interesting to when we come to sort of address that one.
Yeah,
do you have, so I'm just looking in the chat again. Do you have any suggestions for how primary schools can get involved or resources that you can signpost me to? We've just
that one's
started
for me,
Hedgehog Friendly
so don't worry about
Schools.
it. That one's for us.
I mean, yeah, there's loads of resources, isn't there?
Yeah,
oh yeah, I
there's
can
loads
see
of stuff on Hedgehog Street as well that do loads of resources for primary schools as well, Joe. But I'll be in touch to send you any links about that.
I don't think there was any more in the chat. Oh no.
No, I can't see any. Has anyone got any more questions for Grace before we end the session? No? Great stuff. You must have covered them all then, Grace. Yeah, thanks again for coming along to deliver this for us. I've certainly learned more about the strategy. And thank you to everyone else for attending and giving up your lunch break just to learn a little bit more about this and for all your insightful questions and thoughts in the chat as well. So thank you for that.